I'm Alexandra Wolf-Schiff. I wanted to welcome Alex Karp, CEO, and thank everybody for watching.
Well, thank you, everyone who's attending, for coming to our Investor Day.
I wanted to ask a bit about how much the company's really transformed in the last couple of years in terms of its economics, and you've had a huge explosion of growth in revenue just in the last year. How did that happen?
I think one of the interesting things about being a private company is as we've gone through this listing process, people got to see our GAAP numbers. And of course, what jumped out at a lot of people was that we grew 49% at the beginning of the year, that our software margins are super solid, and that we grew this 49% off of a pretty large base. And more people spend more time looking at other companies. Will note that there are very, very, very few companies, if any, that are similar to Palantir in any way, that are growing 49% off of a large base with the margins we have, both gross margins and contribution margins. And then the question becomes, well, how does a company which has been in existence for 17 years and has this significant gap scale surge forward? And that's, in order to understand it, you have to understand that our business model is actually very different than what you'll find in other software companies. Palantir builds products approximately 5 years before the world knows that it needs these products. If you look at our two core products, PG and Foundry, they were both conceived. PG was conceived when people thought that integrating data according to norms and the scale and intricate issues involved in data in the government context, especially in the anti-terror context, was a worthless way to look at data, especially the idea that data protection civil liberties would be a necessary part of working with data. This was at least 5 years, if not 10 years, ahead of its time. And then Foundry, which was conceived of roughly 4.5 years ago, 5 years ago, and really came into fruition. We put all of our customers, commercial customers, in Foundry in 2017, but it was the need to supply a complete stack of software to an enterprise was built on the bias that we believed that crisis in the Western world would be so extreme that the Frankenstein monster way of servicing an enterprise with 50 different products that have to be sewn together by a myriad of engineers, none of whom in particular are coordinated, but on the back of PowerPoints that take years to develop, if not, and a cost structure that can go into the hundreds of millions, would not work in a time of macro, either economic or political crisis. Of course, we didn't know that COVID would come, but we were betting that there would be economic and political conditions that meant the old way of building the Frankenstein monster internally, or purchasing 50 products that are supposed to be sewn together according to a PowerPoint generated by a non-technical consultant, would not be efficacious when your business would either live or die based on whether you can rebuild your enterprise stack overnight, and in our case, within hours. And so the supposition of Foundry was individual trinkets may be appealing to people building their business based on some report written on past norms and needs, but would not be able to service the needs of a growing, of a market shift of galactic nature. And we put enormous resources against building this. And there was internal disagreement. We're a company that embraces disagreement. But even as of a couple years ago, there was enormous discussion about whether a product that would be ideally suited for a world where everything has to change overnight, as COVID and other future macro and political crisis would generate, would be something when you could just build something much similar that amounts to a little widget that's well understood by everyone because already there's 50,000 reports written about it, and every company has it. That was a subject of enormous debate. And had we been wrong about the way the world was gone, people would be questioning whether we're sane or not, or further questioning my lunacy. But the lurching forward of Palantir on revenue, gross margins, contribution margins, is because we built a product 5 years before it was needed, just like we did with PG and just like we'll do in the future. And this is why a small motley crew of a couple thousand people scattered around the globe can generate 49% growth in the first half of this year off of a massive scale. And the magic of Palantir is not what people typically talk about, which is our ability to steadfastly, defend the men and women that defend us, or the fact that we are crucial to some of the largest industry in the world. The magic of Palantir is we build products 5 years before anyone believes they're needed and deliver them at the moment when they are needed. And that's the story of PG, and that's the story of Foundry.
Well, I think also people have similar questions about other Silicon Valley companies. What happens to their data? So how does Palantir differentiate itself in that regard? How does Palantir protect people's data, whereas these other big tech companies
the main
don't?
difference is that we do not mine, purchase, resell, or in any way monetize data. One thing that is not well understood about Palantir is that well over 50% of our revenue historically has come from international contracts, and that is because the more you codify how the data is used, the more valuable our product is. And it's valuable because in a context where there's radical transparency and enforcement about the use and application of data, it's quite frankly very hard to find another product that can do what we do. And so the interesting thing about the civil liberties discussion in our business is the decision to, in the beginning with PG, to both not to solve the problem of reducing terrorism and increasing civil liberties as opposed to sacrificing one to the other was completely an ideological bias driven by the core founding team, and I'm quite proud of that and my role in that. But like many good moral decisions, it's also led to tremendous financial success because the rigor and granularity with which we can use data, make it transparent to a third party, makes it so that we have an enormous structural advantage the more data is regulated for what I would view as legitimate reasons, like who sees it, how long do they see it, under what conditions can they keep it, is the data purged. These are also, there's been a burgeoning rigor around the codification of the use of data, which I as a co-founder and CEO have supported, and as a citizen, and it's just very advantageous for Palantir because we've been thinking and codifying these things in our code since inception. And people just now are beginning to understand the actual necessity to do this, but it's actually nearly impossible to rebuild this into a platform that was not designed to do this, whereas Palantir was designed ex ante to deal with a world in which data was not only had to be available, but had to be rigorously tracked and under very particular circumstances integrated so it could conform with local laws and norms.
COVID-19 is not the first crisis you've dealt with. I mean, you dealt with the aftermath of 9/11, the rise of ISIS. There's so many different events that have happened that Palantir's products have dealt with. And how did you manage to see these things 5 years ahead of time?
We have some structural advantages so that when we interact with clients, we actually understand the technical problems they're trying to solve. We are organized in a way that pushes responsibility to the edges. And we have, in all modesty, among, if not the strongest and most interesting people in the world working at Palantir diligently day and night. But in the end, Palantir is a master of creativity, but we harness this in an exceedingly creative way. and we make bets. Of the 3 big products we've built, 2 were built years before anyone understood it. And there's just a mystical question in philosophy and literature and any métier you look at. How does a philosopher or a writer write something that is actually do something years before anyone understands its value? And you see this, I don't want to bore investors with a philosophical exegesis, but you see this in the great writers, both philosophical, sociological, and in literature, that they capture something that then people understand years later. De facto, what Palantir is doing is the same thing, but in tech. And it has to be organized, so there's an execution element. And the tech has to be by far the best in the world. So you need the best people in the world to do that.
Speaking of people having different kinds of backgrounds, you personally have a degree in philosophy, and I wondered, does that inform your leadership at Palantir, and if so, how?
Palantir has thousands of employees and the factorial of that of opinions. So there's a management aspect, which is that when you're managing people of Palantirians, of talent that we have at Palantir, you have to understand that you will have to convince the person. No Palantirian is going to follow some crazy order that makes no sense. Maybe a couple times a year. But if you have a degree of academic training, you often understand the person talking to you is telling you something that you have to verify yourself. And then there's a proclivity. When you're working in technical, political philosophy, social theory area, you're working on very, very small distinctions that have enormous impact. And you're emotionally tethered to those. And that's the way a technical person works. And you have to be able to work and convince those people to build a product that may be different than the way they would conceive of building the product. And that requires convincing, not order. And I think often people with a more classical business training believe that they get to decide. And then last not least, the interesting thing about these philosophical movements is the ones that were prescient. What is it about somebody or a group of people that saw things that were then seen 100 years later or 20 years later, or in our tech, which would be equivalent 5 years later? And so being focused on what is an idea that will be valuable later is, I think, a particularly useful way to understand academic work. And bringing that into the Palantir culture is something that I'm proud to have played a role in.
You mentioned in the S1 that Palantir will not work with certain totalitarian regimes. And was that a philosophical decision, a moral decision, all of the above? And do you worry that you have competitors that will work with these regimes that Palantir won't? And will that be an advantage?
We have investors that stuck with us through thick and thin over many years. And one of the things that I think it's important to tell future investors is that we have a certain set of beliefs, and we are going to stick with these beliefs. And just like in the past, these beliefs cost us revenue, there will be decisions in the future that cost us revenue. And there will always be somebody who does something that we're not willing to do. And that's just the nature. If you're coming to Palantir as an investor, you need to know that we are going to fight for our culture internally. We are going to stick to certain norms that we've elucidated in the S1. And that if you as an investor would prefer a company that is more open to changing the basic nature of its culture and the norms that it believes in to make extra revenue, you really should pick another company. And the reason why we have, in my view, some of the best investors in the world, especially the Palantirians, we were upfront from the beginning about what we were going to do and what we weren't going to do. And we also delivered. I don't view these things, by the way, as a contradiction. Typically people will say, well, if you don't take every dollar off the table and work with some crazy environment that's doing highly unethical things that are not in accordance with the local law and cannot be justified by any standard, that you are you're being unfair to the investors. But I think if you tell the investors and you tell the people that are at the company from the beginning that there are certain standards we follow independent of revenue opportunities, you get better investors, you get better employees. You should not invest in Palantir if you think we are going to change our internal culture drastically, if you think we are going to work with regimes that are not allied with the US and are abusing human rights, if you think that the future is going to be a super rosy place where the past ways of supplying software are going to work because enterprises and governments do not need to be reformed, you should not invest in Palantir. If you think we are going to reduce the complexity of these issues to some weird soundbite that makes sense to somebody in marketing hired by a consultancy, you should not invest in Palantir. If you think that we will doggedly build the best software in the world years before anyone else, and that we will supply the software at the world's perfect macro timing, we want your support because that's what we've done in the past and that's what we're going to do in the future.
How does artificial intelligence figure into Palantir's future? I know that you've always used a human-driven approach to technology, and I just wonder, is that something that you'll be using more of or less of, and how will that work?
Well, Foundry, it replaces the whole technical stack, and a lot of our clients use it in a human-driven way. Some of our clients are using it on the supply line. Some of our clients are using it to optimize drilling in oil and gas. And some of our clients are using it to run AI against the normalized data. And these things are very effective in all contexts. And I think what you're going to see in the future is that the Palantir stack is used aggressively in some contexts with AI-driven models, aggressively on the assembly line, and aggressively by technical, either technical in their area of expertise or technical in the sense that they can write code on top of the Palantir platform. And those are all use cases. As a company, we're very, very agnostic, and we celebrate the migration in many companies to AI because the AI products don't work unless you have something like Foundry to normalize the data. And they don't work ethically unless you can somehow impose the norms onto the data so that the AI doesn't run amok. So in general, these movements, the AI and political and economic conditions are enormously beneficial in the sense that they expose what part of your tech stack actually works and what part is actually a PowerPoint.
Alex, thank you so much for all of your time, and thank you all for watching.